Now, so it's a great pleasure to introduce James Palmer. James is Professor of History at the University of St Andrews. His work stretches from about 400 to 900 CE. He works on saints and the hagiography. He works on apocalyptic beliefs, not least in his 2014 book, Apocalypse in the Early Middle Ages. He's also been working recently on medical scientific knowledge in late Antiquity, in the early medieval world. And I think we're going to hear some of that today. And also has been inflicting the plague recently on a series of School of History students in his plague module, which I hope we might hear a little bit about, either now or in questions. So yeah, James will speak on pandemic and the medicalisation of religious culture in the West, 540 to 740. James, all yours.
Thank you. I'm sure this works. Yes, as Jason said, I have been attempting to teach a module on pandemic and medical history in the first millennium to students. I wanted to find a way to do medical history of the period more generally. This is quite hard for reasons I will go into. The material is horrible and difficult to access, but also with the big debates on pandemic, which Carl Harper has been quite integral to, it kind of gave a very important present-day hook that we get the students in, and they do kind of intersect. There have been moments teaching the course when I thought that the anxiety about pandemic and interest in medicine were two parallel topics. And this paper is trying to make them talk to each other a little bit, not necessarily a lot, as much as can be. So plague and other diseases undoubtedly shaped the very end of the late antique West. Even if one accepted one of the lower estimates for mortality from the Justinianic pandemic, it can only take a moment to push history in very different directions. An outbreak of plague in Rome in the winter of 589, Helen has already talked about today, and was by all accounts quite deadly. And one could argue that the death of Pope Pelagius II alone within the death toll was particularly consequential because it led to the election of the transformative Pope Gregory the Great. An outbreak of plague in Northumbria in 664 must also stand as a great tragedy, but one could also acknowledge that one of its more enduring consequences was simply how it promoted one holy man called Egbert to flee to Ireland, where he went on to successfully promote Roman practices in the Irish Church and to inspire great missionary enterprises in Germania, which expanded Christendom quite definitively for the rest of the millennium. Pandemics could have important cultural effects, both directly and indirectly. In this present paper, I want to consider how pandemic and similar health crises contributed to a medicalisation within religious cultures. What I mean by this is that pandemic encouraged people to see moral and political conditions within a medical framework, but one which was itself subject to reconfiguration by religious attitudes. I suppose I imagine this as a distant partner to Misha Meyer's argument that crisis in this period led to a liturgification of religion as people sought intercession. In my case, I think that medical knowledge was drawn into religious ways of looking at the world to help explain what was going on, and this is crucial, in a critical framework based on observation and theory, rather than gut belief about eschatology. I am keen not to overstress change. I don't want to say that pandemic caused the defining change in medical knowledge or late antique Christianity. Late antique Christianity was already alive with medical ideas and metaphors, not least because the Bible itself is full of healing and other imagery, as we've already seen a little bit already. Still, I think it can help us to understand some aspects of our written source material and how people understood the pandemics that beset them. So very much ties into the kind of thing that Helen was looking to explain in her project. It is perhaps worth highlighting some issues with histories of medicine here. On the whole, no one has looked very much into medical knowledge within the context of the pandemic debate specifically. But there are probably a couple of good reasons for this. First, there isn't actually a lot on plague in early medical writings. Even Galen, who witnessed the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, didn't have too much to say about it, apart from that he was frustrated that his slaves died. In a second reason, that's more frustrating, no one really rates late antique and early medieval medicine anyway. A surprising amount of it remains uncatalogued, unedited, and unstudied as a result. This goes right back to attitudes fermented at the beginnings of modern histories of medicine with scholars such as Julius Pagels and, on the left here, Karl Zudhoff in the 19th century, scholars who were frequently appalled by how basic Latin medicine seemed compared to earlier Greek medicine, or, on the right-hand side, philologists such as Valentine Rosa, who found the barbaric Latin of these texts really quite troublesome. Curiously, although there was never any substantial culture of Latin medicine in the later Roman Empire, to the extent that it lacked the language itself lacked a technical vocabulary separate from the Greek. And even so, this has been made as accusations of a substantial post-Roman decline. You can't really decline from something you've never had. This was, of course, blamed on A, barbarians being incapable of appreciating clever intellectual things and the lovely inheritance of the Roman Empire, and B, monks for subverting medicine by preserving it because it was useful. You have to get your head around that one. But really, because it was useful, they didn't want to expand it. It's a very passive copying argument. Now, some people have been a little bit more positive, from Charles Damberg and Lauren McKinney to more recently Peregrine Horden and Meg Leyer. As a neat indication of progress being made, a project led by Karine van Rijn in Utrecht and Claire Burge in Sheffield has recently doubled the number of known medical manuscripts produced before the rise of the Salerno Medical School in the 11th century. Doubled the number. This is how inattentive people have been to this as a subject. There remains little point in trying to argue that early medieval Latin medicine was more sophisticated than people believe. A lot of it is still very bad medicine that will not impress anyone who knows anything about medicine. But I think it's worth simply highlighting that our key witnesses in the West, people like Gregory of Tours, Isidore of Seville, and Bede, my main people for today, but also many other anonymous writers, they weren't trying to be physicians and they weren't trying to be medical experts. They were bishops, educators, and curious individuals who sought to find ways to see the world that would assist with salvation and other issues. It can therefore be worth exploring how and why they turned to medical knowledge and expertise when they could. So what might intellectual motivations be? Well, first up, pestilence was a recognised punishment and sign. In our context, just to pick out a couple of well-known examples from the Bible, we might look at something like Exodus and plague of boils at the top. Although that, as far as many exegetes in the early medieval West were concerned, was a historical past event and therefore not necessarily useful for illuminating the present day as well as words of prophets. Perhaps more worryingly for people is the little apocalypse preached by Christ, particularly in the version initially by Gospel of Luke in the Greek, in which it was one of the many, pestilence was one of the many indications that the last days were upon the world. It made for a nice little alliterative threat in the Greek, lumos kai oikos, but it was absent initially from Matthew and Mark, but in the Vulgate, Jerome added pestilentia to Matthew in the corresponding passage. In Latin traditions, at least from the mid-5th century onwards, there was little appetite for literal readings of such signs. Jerome himself, in his commentary on Matthew, argued that pestilence was one type of motif that signalled the creeping spread of the word of Antichrist in the world. 4 centuries later, Bede, in his commentary on Luke, had no interest in doing anything more than repeating Jerome's interpretation. As a type of affliction, pestilence could be recast so that it was no longer about disease at all. An unscientific quick survey through Patrologia Latina suggested that pestilentia and other words are more frequently applied to the spread of heresy than to outbreaks of disease. Such thinking could distort how people saw past descriptions of disease in the past. In the chronological canons of Eusebius Jerome, for example, we do have notes on how the Antonine Plague devastated Rome and the Roman army. In a précis used in the 7th century Chronicle of Fredegar, that pestilence was recast as attacked by barbarian hordes, because why else would the Roman army have been devastated? Treating something like pandemic as a signifier of something else only generates antipathy in traditional histories of medicine and science. Over the past 200 or 300 years, plenty of writers have taken it as an indifference towards the natural world and reality more generally. This is perhaps to understand the potential value afforded to misunderstand the potential value afforded medical and scientific knowledge within religious culture for generating certain knowledge. The best works of natural philosophy from between the 6th and 9th centuries are, to be sure, mostly poor works of science, but they were not intended to be works of science. But they are quite effective as what they are intended to be, which is attempts to apply wisdom and critical knowledge to the natural learning, to the natural world that could help to understand creation better. The most powerful example, and most commonly used example, is eclipses. People who didn't know any better claimed that eclipses were portents, but anybody who knew actually how lunisolar cycles work knew that they were a perfectly ordinary part of an orderly and rhythmical creation. An eclipse had to be demonstrably unusual and out of line with the mathematical order of the heavens to be considered a portent. Medical knowledge in these contexts is an obvious thing in late antique and early medieval Christians might want to read. The Bible has many references to disease, to acts of healing, and indeed to herbs having medicinal properties. We can look at how, for example, Theodore of Tarsus in the 7th century draws on medical learning to explain the power of mandrakes to send people to sleep, or glossing Genesis, the story when Reuben has lots of mandrakes. Any good exegete or pastor knew that one had to know at least a little bit about these things to be able to offer accurate commentary on both scripture and events in the world. You had to read medicine to know things weren't just random. Even Augustine knew this, not least because part of his intellectual journey in North Africa was kick-started by receiving a lecture by the famed physician Vindicianus, who explained to him how one actually applied logic and reason to arguments. This is all great in principle. Well, I think the Justinianic pandemic gives things a bit of a kick, is this. It is clear from Procopius's account of the plague in Constantinople that, at least for some people, Hippocratic Galenic medicine was incapable of explaining what was going on because of the way it emphasized the normal framework for understanding medicine, emphasized variations in environment, age, season, and gender. But none of these were of any hope in the face of disease that was killing people indiscriminately. But rather than a rejection of medicine, this led to new ways of people trying to analyze pandemic events. Then we can see a little bit of this of Gregory of Tours, writing across the 580s and early 590s in Gaul. I don't want to say too much here on Gregory's views on plague, as these have been covered at length in a recent article by Michael McCormick in the journal Speculum. Gregory provides a rich series of snapshots of living with outbreaks of plague and other diseases in the generation after the original outbreaks of the Justinianic pandemic. McCormick raises some useful points about Gregory's reportage being broadly likely true because A, he and people around him suffered from health crises on a regular basis that forced them to analyse what was going on, and B, most of it plausibly fits with what we know about plague and other outbreaks of disease. But I think we can push this a bit further. In an often overlooked article from 2008, Faith Wallace made a strong case for reading Gregory's accounts of bodily evacuations and healings as deployments of engaged medical knowledge. His description of nosebleeds, for example, chimes well with passages in the Hippocratic aphorisms and prognosis. One might add to this Gregory's famous attempts to proclaim dust from the tomb of St. Martin as medically efficacious, which is, we've got this on the board here, seems to draw on actual knowledge of herbal, similar to Dioscorides. Little hints are here that pyrethrum is not a common ingredient that one would just find around a market in Gaul, and he uses the word scamonia instead of what we're assured in various sources that the more normal Gallic phrase would be agredium. So he is using specialist medical knowledge to make the case against herbs, but he has to have known that in the first place. Gregory's interest in medicine, even if it was a little lukewarm, led him to consider plague, at least in part, as a natural phenomenon. Sorry, this is very wordy, but I will break this down. Gregory's interest We'll take the story of an outbreak of plague in Marseille in 588. There are two parts to this story. First, it spreads to, this isn't on the board, it spreads to Saint Symphorien and Vauzon, just outside Lyon, and King Guntram orders vigils, more of Mayer's liturgification, along with barley bread and clean water. This looks like a simple extension of what one would do in a vigil, and a dull passing reference to a preference for Franks eating barley bread instead of wheat. Except that, this is a very soft point, one might note that barley was considered to have useful purificatory properties in different forms and was a base ingredient used in most treatments in medical literature that was around. So making a distinct choice to go for barley rather than wheat bread could be deliberate, especially as it's supposed to be very useful for treating dysentery or dysenteric conditions. The second part of the story of the outbreak takes us deep into the heart of Marseille, and this is what we have. But it has a precision for it if you look for it. None of the language that Gregory uses to describe the plague is in terms of pestilencia or great mortality or other such things. And McCormick, I think, he is right here that the words and phrases chosen by Gregory in general are not accidental, and neither is the structure of the story. He tells it as a contagion. It comes from Spain. It's not a punishment from God. People deal with it for a time by running away out of the city, and then after a time it has died down and they come back. There's a bit of fancy wordplay involved in the story in the way, see in the middle, that this is all very much an extended metaphor about fires and how they spread. But this is profiling the behaviour of the plague by someone who has studied some medicine to think about what is going on. If you were going to make this part of an eschatological drama, you would have mixed this in with stories of sin and biblical references, of which there is nothing. There is only talk of contagion. This is a very carefully analysed outbreak. Some of this, the importance of this, can be seen in a later story about the aftermath of plague. In a gloomy account of 591, he explicitly invokes the passage from Matthew about pestilence as a sign of the end, alongside famine and pseudo-teachers. It's the way that these intersect that gives him a force of interpretation. He could see all of these things together in the world. Just pestilence alone was not enough. And indeed, in that particular case, it's a pseudo-teacher, a false Christ, who immediately comes forward and starts preaching in the backdrop of a pandemic, and he proclaims himself second Christ, itself an apocalyptic move. And what does the charismatic do to win over the people once he has set himself up in this plague-ravaged south of Gaul? He makes unfounded predictions about the future course of the plague and how people will be healed or not healed. That's the kind of thing that annoyed Gregory. Not just that there were bad teachings, but bad teachings in which people, ignorance, led to the interpretation of the natural world around them, to lead astray uneducated people by untrustworthy people. Medicine did not need to be rejected in this context. It needs to be looked after carefully and left in the hands of authorities, preferably, in his case, himself, as he would like to believe. This brings me to a second crucial effort to shepherd such knowledge. An important voice in the formation of early medieval thinking about pandemic was everyone's favourite pun-obsessed polymath, Isidore of Seville. To Isidore, in fact, we actually owe our first two efforts to formulate ideas in Latin on what the plague actually was. It is difficult to know how badly ravaged by plague the Iberian Peninsula is, although we heard earlier some interesting evidence of getting more data that it was in the Iberian Peninsula early and widely. Isidore's first effort came in his short digest of natural philosophy, De Natura Rerum. It's essential to be clear about what Isidore's purpose in writing De Natura Rerum was, because he did not merely randomly think that writing a little textbook on cosmography was a good idea. The composition of the piece occurred in the context of debates over the possible meaning of 3 lunar eclipses and a solar eclipse between March 611 and August 612. This was taken to be an ominous sign by people who had never seen so many eclipses in quick succession. But, as Isidore and his correspondent King Sigismund knew, and King Sigismund wrote a poem on the subject, eclipses were a perfectly normal part of natural order, being determined by the intersections of lunisolar cycles, as I have said. De Natura Rerum was a learned polemic outlining the orderliness of creation for the credulous. Pestilence in this context has provided some parameters. have here. It was obviously a disease that was spread by contagion and killed quickly. Some people, he noted, thought it was connected to sin, but he moves along very quickly. They thought it came about through a corruption of the normal order of things, for instance, through excessive rain and excessive heat. Ideas that do have a good Hippocratic pedigree, as we shall see later. This sense of disorder connects to a belief reported by both Isidore and Gregory of Tours in his De Cursu Stellarum that comets sometimes portended plagues, a belief that may have stemmed from the fact that comets, like plagues, were radically unpredictable. Isidore could have left it at that, but went on to note alternative points of view that he has been sifting around literature looking for. He draws here creatively on Lucretius's poem De Natura Rerum, but so creatively it is really very hard-pressed into what he wanted to say. He notes that others say plague was caused by corrupt particles in the air travelling from their normal region. On the one hand, this may simply reflect Isidore having read Lucretius, but the way he wants to talk about the mechanics of contagion wasn't really what Lucretius had intended his words to be meant. We might remember that in Gregory's account of plague in Marseille, people left the city until it burned out. A near contemporary letter to Isidore by Gallus of Auvergne encouraged Desiderius of Cahors to block roads until an outbreak had gone. And we can think about people are worried about contagion, and the mechanics of contagion goes well beyond simply worrying about punishment for sin. They are reading what they can. Isidore's second attempt at conceptualizing plague is a departure from the first more in terms of purpose than science. It comes in his Etymologies, his famous encyclopedic work, at the very end of a brief catalogue of acute, that is, short-term diseases, which is a common kind of medical reference text. Isidore was certainly able here to use Caelius Aurelianus's on acute diseases, and may have had at least one other similar kind of catalogue to hand in drawing up his list. Their problem is that they don't include anything on plague. So Isidore had deliberately supplemented the information that he found in his medical books in a punchier entry. Here he provided them in De Natura Rerum. Pestilence is still a contagion, but it's still a matter of airborne potencies, and it might possibly come about by the will of God. It is more interesting for introducing some unconvincing wordplay, and further down we get into it. First, he says that pestilentia is from pastulentia, because it consumes, whatever. And then he says the synonym lues plays off the word labes and luctus. Gregory speaks Latin, so Greek, he knows full well that it's descended from that. Within Isidore's usual mode, it is surprising he didn't draw the obvious connections to the Greek, in fact. And what we perhaps see is a use of alliteration to make a semantic range memorable because of content rather than accuracy. And after all, this was what Isidore's purpose was. As an educator and pastor, he wanted to educate people. He was not a physician, and he was not a philosopher. This brings us to my final example, Bede, writing in the early 8th century in Northumbria. Bede had studied both of our previous two writers, writing plague had affected England and Ireland a few times, but two outbreaks particular for Bede in 664-6 and 684-7 were the most dramatic. These were events that defined a generation, and through the trauma of death and through the migrations they caused as people fled. One can detect a subtle difference in language between Gregory and the narrators of these outbreaks, which included various hagiographers alongside Bede. The most common used word to describe this, in fact, is mortalitas, often with great or savage. This kind of talk of mortality rather than pestilence, rather than disease, rather than plague, has a character of collective memory of a moment of crisis rather than an interest in medical precision. Edmund of Iona sometimes uses morbus or pestilentia as backup or synonyms, and Bede's normal go-to word is plaga. None of our accounts have the forensic attention to detail and process that Gregory's account of Marseille had. But we have to be careful here not to read the surface for the whole. One of the leading intellectuals of plague in these years has been Theodore of Tarsus, the papally imposed Archbishop of Canterbury, who reportedly taught his pupils both real medical learning and contributed to the framing of penance, which covered issues of health as well as sin, as a medicine for the soul. The first miracle recorded in English historiography by an anonymous monk in Lindisfarne concerned how St. Cuthbert was taught by an angel how to make a poultice to help treat a swollen knee. There's a lot of evidence to show that a lot of the books that were carried to the early English churches at Stock New Cathedral and monastic libraries were libri medicinales. There was an appetite for medical learning, and it was valued. There was still a problem that there was little more in these books than Gregory and Isidore about plague itself. So Bede was not indifferent to what plague was. He maintained a chapter on pestilence in his own early work, De Natura Rerum, produced around 702 or 3, which worked as a simplified and refined version of Isidore's text by the same name, offering his students a more accessible snapshot of a lightly Christianized cosmography. In this instance, Bede kept only one sentence from Isidore about the corruption of the air and how it led to contagion. He then added a novel part in the bottom, which seems something of a non sequitur about storms and their relevance for understanding pestilence. As Faith Wallace has observed, this makes a lot of sense in a Hippocratic framework, possibly inspired by a work such as Airs, Waters and Places, which was certainly known in Latin translation, although this is a gratuitous slide because I had to read it in the 9th century manuscript because I couldn't get hold of the 1911 edition. Bit more hard work. The work as a whole has a section on how disease arises from specifically unseasonable weather. In that sense, Bede can be perhaps developing the Hippocratic dimension of Isidore's comments on the corruption of the air by bringing it closer to a recognised authoritative text. At the same time, Hippocrates had become agnostic on the causes of season, what causes seasons to depart from normal patterns. To Bede, however, it was obvious. Nature behaving out of character was a portent or sign, prodigia vel signa, because only God could author such things. For Wallace, this led Bede to a situation in which he could have had his cake and eat it too, both because it's both a sign and a natural thing. Even so, it pushes what I hope is now a familiar line. It removes interpretation of pestilential disease from the realms of the purely arbitrary, I think that's a sign that one isn't, to something that requires contextualization and learned authority to be understood for what it truly is. This a little bit more in one final example. We can see when he was younger, Bede composed a commentary on Acts of the Apostles, and when it came towards the end to the father of Publius being cured of dysentery, Bede used this as an opportunity to promote the communal spiritual benefits of healing the unfaithful. Later in his career, he produced a retractio in which he could use new learning to reframe scripture. On Publius's dysentery, he now threw out his previous musings, and instead he sought to explain dysenteric disease. First, he did this with a passage from Cassius Felix's De Medicina on dysentery, which itself is interesting for bringing an actual medical text in to clarify biblical exegesis. It's also doubly interesting, why I've got the picture of the manuscript here, is that Bede's specific wording fits better an excerpt found from a medical book from around 800 in Dijon than anything in the standard modern edition of the text, which didn't use either Bede or this, which connects Bede's medical learning to knowledge of medical learning in Francia more specifically. Anyway, this is where it gets more interesting for us, I suspect. Bede backs up Cassius with a passage from Gregory's Histories on the symptoms people suffered from an outbreak of a dysenteric disease of 580, which, well, interpretations vary. It could have been smallpox, it could have been plague, it could have been anything. What is interesting is that Bede edited the passage to remove a section down at the end in which Gregory had noted an outbreak of pustules being reported, or hidden pustules. These were not in keeping with what Bede understood to be involved in dysentery. One might wonder if Bede actually thought that Gregory was misreporting either misreporting plague or had been adding details, symptoms that just did not belong with dysentery. But the important thing is that he felt that Gregory needed to be corrected to maintain the accuracy of the reporting. Medical knowledge was actively shaping how disease in biblical and recent history was portrayed. Bringing me to my conclusion. So, medicine, health, ritual purity, and salvation had become deeply entwined and found many new expressions in the period I've discussed today. Recent work by Meg Lair, Claire Burridge and Karen Van Ryan has shown this only continued and diversified across the Latin world in the 9th century. It is, I think, too much to say that experience of pandemic alone caused this important blending of Christian and medical learning on its own terms. And yet, I think we can discuss something here as stimulus. Pestilence was supposed to be symbolically meaningful, but signs had to be assessed so that one can distinguish between nature and portent. But as valuable as medical learning was, it did not offer much information for understanding pandemics. So, writers such as Gregory, Isidore and Bede did give thought to what outbreaks of illness really were, and read widely to be able to do that. And this helped them to contribute to new intersections between medical and religious culture in the period when there is not supposed to have been much medical learning ongoing. As I said, this may still have been bad medicine. It may not have generated results that old school historians of medicine might like. I really doubt that Zuthoff or others would be particularly impressed at all. But in context, it shows engaged efforts to understand natural phenomena critically and to develop new knowledge despite the paucity of intellectual resources available to people. To use Lucretius, for example, with Isidore, is to work with what he could find to express what he could observe. Creation was held to be orderly and one needed scientia to understand it, and that is one of Isidore's favourite words to describe this. Pandemics, like eclipses, provided exactly the kind of challenges that demanded more knowledge, not less. Once again, we find that pandemic here seems not inconsequential. It was very much consequential, promoted new learning. And pandemic certainly was not in this context necessarily the end of the world. Thank you.